Hi, welcome everybody to the last Kavli Conversation of the semester. My name is Dan Fagan, and I'm a professor of journalism here at the Carter Institute of Journalism at New York University. I'm also the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. So we're very heavily invested in the business of more and better science communication for the benefit of our fragile democracy here in the United States and around the world. So for this reason, I'm especially excited about tonight and very grateful to David Wallace-Wells and to Michael Mann. It's an honor to have them both here. And while I will leave the formal introductions to Lee, I do want to say that the fact that they were both willing to come, in Michael's case, all the way from Penn State, means a lot. And the fact that David was willing to come and talk about a story that generated a lot of heat and also a lot of light, well, I'm really grateful for that, too. For the formal introductions, I'll leave it to Robert Lee Holtz, who is, of course, as always, our highly intelligent, esteemed, erudite moderator for the Kavli Conversations. He is the science writer at the Wall Street Journal and a distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute. So Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Fagan. I'm always wondering how that sentence is going to end. So welcome everybody to the Kavli Conversations on Science Communications. For our conversation tonight, we turn to climate change. Science journalism and the proper role of the scientist in communications and all the twists and turns of conveying a leading researcher who has, in addition to their own scientific contribution, has made a point of reaching out to the general public about their work, and an esteemed science journalist who covers the field that scientist works in. And with those two, we will explore how they best bring the general public into the community of discovery. Now, these conversations are sponsored by the Kavli Foundation and the NYU Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program under the directorship of Dan Fagan. So just to reiterate as we go, this is not a lecture. This is a conversation. So I encourage all of you to politely, respectfully interrupt us, make us digress, make us go up the interesting blind alleys that a good conversation will lead. And when you do that, please use the microphone. And for those of you who are watching this online, please tweet us your questions using the hashtag KavliConvo. Now, as science journalists, as environmental reporters, as medical writers, as concerned scientists, we entertain, we inform, we challenge, and when it warrants, we want to warn the public, our public, about impending threats of future harm uncovered by our reporting of new research. And that goes to the heart of the central purpose. It goes to our place in the scheme of things. On our best days, we are the tripwire. So in that spirit, few issues these days attract quite so much coverage and controversy as climate change. And here we face a problem. The Atlantic recently put it very nicely when they called climate change a stuck issue in American politics. Polling continually points to a larger conclusion. Global warming is highly partisan. Most voters do not consider it particularly significant to them personally, even if they are worried about it. Now, a recent Yale poll put it very starkly. More than 50% of Americans believe that climate change will, quote, harm people in the United States, unquote. But fewer than 40% believe that it will, quote, harm me personally. Interesting. And there's it's like a 4 in 10 chance among those people that they believe that there's a better than even odds that global warming will actually lead to the extinction of the human species. Now, given those sorts of feelings, it's curious that we're stuck kind of 50-50 in this country about what to do, how to go forward, how much attention we should pay. And that's where, of course, we come in. What's the right way to get their attention? What's the proper balance? What's the proper language? Should we worry about messaging? Are facts enough? So, if humans are doomed, what's the best way to break the news? So we're joined tonight by David Wallace Wells, who's deputy editor at New York Magazine, where he also writes about science and what they like to call the near future. And he is serving as the trampoline, if I may put it that way, from which we are going to jump into this topic. So you were wondering how that sentence was going to end. Because we're going to take as the text for our conversation this evening a New York Magazine cover story that it ran in July, this past July, on the worst case scenarios for climate change and the globe that we inhabit. And it's interesting that this was the most read story in the 49 years that New York Magazine has been publishing. And it evoked an interesting and passionate response amongst many people. David also writes the Tomorrow column at the magazine, which kind of goes into the future of science and technology. He began there as literary editor in 2011, became features director in 2016, and he also oversees the magazine's collection of podcasts in addition to his other duties. Interestingly, to me anyway, before joining New York Magazine, David was deputy editor at the Paris Review, where he edited and published writers such as Ann Beattie and Werner Herzog and Jonathan Franzen, Janet Malcolm, and others. He's a graduate of Brown University, where he trained as a historian, and he is, curiously, a native New Yorker, that rarest of things in the village. And he makes his home in Manhattan. On my immediate left here, we're joined by Michael Mann, a pioneering climatologist at Penn State University. And now he's known primarily for his 1999 hockey stick graph, which became a kind of touchstone for climate denialism and sustained sort of political attack on the veracity of climate science by both industrial and congressional forces in the U.S. He also was a key author and has been steadily involved in the UN IPCC reporting process. And he's written more than 200 peer-reviewed papers. He's published 3 books. The first is Dire Predictions, Understanding Global Warming, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, Dispatches from the Front Lines, and then together with co-author Tom Tolles, The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics and Driving Us Crazy. That one came out last year. You can see how the subject has evolved. So much of the public conversation about climate is couched in predictions, hypothetical scenarios, and threats of dire harm to future generations, never quite to us. So what I'd like to do here is start by asking you each how you come to this issue, how you, David, come as a journalist, and you, Michael, as a science communicator. David, you're a literary editor, you're coming out of the tradition of the Paris Review. How do you come to climate coverage, and particularly this story?
As a journalist, I mean, there was, I think it's sort of simple story. I was looking at a lot of news out of science and reading some academic papers, sort of, some darker corners of the internet, and just saw a story that hadn't been told really dramatically in a publication like the one that I was working for. And, I'd been following climate news for a while. I'd, as you said, interested in science for a while. But sometime over the last year and a half, it just seemed to me that I was seeing more and more quite scary stories, especially about new research that was coming out about climate. And I felt as a reader that, the mainstream media, like the publication I work for, had done a relatively good job of communicating what I think of as basically the kind of median outcome for climate change, which is probably 2, maybe 2.5 degrees of Celsius of warming, and had done a reasonably good job of communicating the issue of sea level rise, but had, to my mind, not really done a very good job of communicating all of the other threats that climate poses to us, and had not really broached the subject, or I should say successfully communicated to the public, the whole second half of the bell curve beyond the median outcome, what the 75th percentile outcome was going to be, what the 95th outcome was going to be. And so I set about trying to sort of combine those two stories to look at what things would look like if climate was considerably worse than we were expecting, and to spell out all of the many ways that that could affect us. And to your point about that Yale survey, and the fact that most people think of the threat of climate change as being, directed at people maybe in the United States, but often elsewhere in the world, I was really hoping to the extent that I was working as a kind of advocate, which is really a secondary purpose for me, to shake that perception and show through extreme weather, through effects on agriculture, through public health effects, through all of these different scenarios, that climate change was going to affect everybody on the planet, change the shape of every life on the planet, and that we couldn't comfort ourselves by saying, well, I don't live in Miami, I don't live near the sea, I'll be okay. And we can talk a little bit more about how I went about doing that, but that's basically how I embarked on a project.
Michael, you coming this from the other side of the fence. I mean, in a way, David's in the business of seeking public attention. I mean, public attention kind of found you.
Yeah, that's right. Back in the late 1990s, now nearly 2 decades ago, as you alluded to, my co-authors and I published this now iconic study and presented this curve called the hockey stick because of its shape. It was an estimate of how temperatures have varied over the Earth over the past 1,000 years. And it had the shape of a hockey stick, which is to say there was this blade at the end, which is the warming of the past century, which has no precedent as far back as you can go along the handle of that hockey stick. And it became an icon in the climate change debate, I think because it told a simple story. You didn't need to understand the complexities of climate science, the physics and the mathematics of its climate system to understand what this graph was telling us, that there was something unprecedented taking place today in our climate. And by inference, it probably has something to do with us. It probably isn't a coincidence that it coincides with the Industrial Revolution. And because it really presented such a simple story, it was perceived as a threat by some pretty powerful special interests who have been looking to discredit the case for concern over climate change. Fossil fuel interests who don't want to see us move away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, climate change poses a threat to them because the underlying source of the problem is our continued burning of fossil fuels and the increasing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So I, as a postdoc, a fairly young scientist at the time, suddenly found myself in a world that I had never expected to be in. When I double majored in applied math and physics at UC Berkeley, when I went off to Yale University to study theoretical physics, and then eventually moved into climate science, little did I realize that I was setting out on a path that would eventually lead me to the very center of one of the most contentious societal debates that we've ever had, the debate over climate change and what to do about it. So, as a scientist, that is a bizarre world to find yourself in. Science doesn't train you for that. But I found myself at the center of this raging debate, and I decided to embrace that. It's not what I signed up for. It's not how I expected to be spending my time, my life as a scientist. What got me excited about science was the thing that I love to do the most, which is trying to solve interesting problems, using inventive methods to get solutions to interesting outstanding problems. But my scientific work led me into this entirely different world. It led me into the center of this debate.
Yeah,
and
I've
embraced
interrupt
that.
you for a second, because you're
Yeah.
you keep calling sort of it a debate
Yeah.
in the controversy, which sounds sort of, nicely low key, but we're really talking about you were targeted by the Virginia State Attorney General, you were been dragged before Congress a number of times, your integrity questioned.
Yeah.
You finally, I think, resorted to legal action to sue your critics for defamation because they were accusing you of fraud. This has not been a low-key academic controversy that you have
Not at all.
embraced, if I may say, whether you liked it or not.
Yeah, not at all. In science, you expect to be involved in good faith debates over what the data show, over whether your hypotheses hold up. There's a certain approach to doing science. There's a certain set of rules by which science is done. And here, all of a sudden, you find yourself in a world that's governed by very different rules, where your critics don't necessarily observe the standards of scientific, legitimate, good faith scientific debate, where it's about a character assassination. It's about ad hominem efforts to undermine your credibility, even leading to threats against your livelihood and your life. That's not what scientists expect to have to be doing. But that is where I found myself.
Now, and I'm going to go back to David here in a sec, but I want to, before I leave you, many people would have reacted to that kind of pressure, particularly many people who are, for lack of a better phrase, we'll call the scientific temperament, contemplative, interested in their particular field of study, like a quiet place to think about things, would have withdrawn. It's quite striking that, quite to the contrary, you have embraced the combat of public policy. I should have mentioned, I didn't, that among all of those other things, you are a participant in the Real Climate blog with Gavin Schmidt and others. Gavin has been a guest here before, and it just serves as a kind of reality check on a moment-to-moment controversy. So you have really embraced sort of the scientist as public communicator. That seems a little contrarian, given your circumstances.
And heroic.
Thank you. Well,
I agree, and heroic.
Well, thank you. As I said, it's not what I set out to do. I would have perhaps very much enjoyed the contemplative life that you describe and just sort of working on interesting scientific problems. But because my path led me to this, again, the center of this contentious debate, I ultimately did embrace that. I accepted that, whether I liked it or not, I was going to have to defend myself, I was going to have to defend my science, but now I was being used, and my science was being used as a proxy to undermine the public faith in the science of climate change writ large. And so there was a greater responsibility that I had to not just defend myself, but to defend the science against bad faith attacks, against bad faith efforts to discredit the science to advance a specific policy agenda. And over time, I have grown to embrace that role.
So it's interesting, and this is where the two of you kind of mesh. Your work and your first public act, if you like, the hockey stick graph, is a record of what has occurred. It's a record of the past. It's a picture of reality. And David, your piece kind of picks up where the hockey graph leaves off. It's looking at the various dotted line scenarios that kind of branch off from Dr. Mann's reality check. So I'm curious why you took that approach. Certainly the reality is disconcerting and troubling enough. Why go for the worst case scenarios?
Well,
I should tell you all, I apologize, for those of you who hadn't read, the headline, the lead headline on the magazine story was "The Uninhabitable Earth," was kind of the tone of the piece. So,
yeah, it connects to what I was saying before in response to your first question. I thought that people like me, I'm not an environmentalist. I have very little background in that. I have very little, I'm a native New Yorker, as you said. I have very little affection for nature. I've not really thought of myself as I'm not an animal lover. I've never gone hiking. I've never gone camping. And I felt, that people like me who are sort of well-informed, progressive-minded, relatively well-off people in the West, had a relatively well-informed sense of, as I said before, something like what we think of as the median outcome for climate change. And I thought that there was something really missing from our conception, that we didn't appreciate that median outcome was a median outcome. We thought of it, because it was sort of the worst picture that we had been sent, we thought of it as something like a worst-case scenario. And that can be really distorting on how you think of what's likely and what's possible. If the worst thing you've ever heard is that it's going to be 80 degrees and the coldest it's going to be is 20 degrees, that's one thing. If you know that it's possible that it could be 120 degrees at the beach, then that's going to be a whole different set of calculations you make. And I felt, there was a kind of public purpose in doing that. I did think that in order to think about what's likely, it helps to have a good sense of the extreme fringes of the bell curve. But I also, as I said before, I went at it really primarily from a storytelling, out of a storytelling impulse to showcase what was possible and had been sort of insufficiently portrayed by media publications like my own. And the way that I did that was I took the UN's projections, which are not perfect and probably already a little bit out of date, but basically the best that we have for sort of consensus view of where things are going. And I should say the projections for what would happen if we don't take action on climate. And took them to a bunch of scientists who studied particular subfields and asked them, well, if we get to 4 degrees of warming, what will that look like for what you study? If we get to 8 degrees of warming, which is sort of the freaky end of the bell curve for the next century, what will that mean? And then I published those answers almost verbatim. In some cases truly verbatim, in other cases in ways that I summarized and then showcased for the scientists to approve. Yeah. And I really wanted to, as I said before, do those 2 big things to make sure that people understood that there were many worse possibilities out there, and to show them that it was a much bigger, more complicated story than sea level rise.
well, see, what was interesting, I think, about the reaction to your piece, which was very strong, was that it had a lot of detractors, and the detractors, surprisingly, were not the sort of usual climate denialist things. They actually, a great many of them were climate experts and other reporters. And the issue, certainly with a long piece like that, there are often technical quibbles, and there were certainly a couple of those. But that, by and large, the overall objection would kind of be summed up by just simply saying it was too scary. It was too bleak. It was too alarmist. And I think you called it doomist framing, Michael. What do you mean, doomist framing?
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate because, well, the way that that debate became framed, often when you have differences on social media, on Twitter, there's a tendency for it to devolve into a food fight, and it's very difficult to have the more nuanced discussions, which we're going to be able to have here.
Right, we're having the nuanced discussion
exactly,
right now.
Exactly.
So what did you mean by doom? In a nuanced way, what did you mean by doom? I'm not trying to get you to throw a cupcake at it. I'm trying to understand your point of view.
And frankly, I don't think David had any role in in the decision over, first of all, what the title of the piece ended up being. That was an editorial decision.
He's an editor.
Well, I don't know if that was your title or your editor's
I mean,
title.
I didn't object to it, in fairness.
That's true, yeah. Reporters do get to object sometimes.
But it's important because sometimes, I have seen journalists criticized over, the title of the piece when they didn't actually have a role in that. And the title, Uninhabitable Earth, obviously, that does sort of present a doom and gloom scenario of the future. And what I was most concerned about, and my concerns were, again, when I initially expressed them, my concern was that the framing, I think, is sort of unusually doomist, and it sort of devolved into, well, you're criticizing the piece. The piece, by and large, I thought was a very good work of journalism, and David Sintz has done another really nice article on climate for the New York Magazine. And the debate was really about, the framing. The title presents that sort of doomist framing. And there are individuals out there who shall remain nameless who have said things like, we are now, destined for inevitable, societal collapse, that humans will go extinct in 10 to 15 years because of uncontrollable climate change, and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, I find that, first of all, if it were true, that would be one thing. If that were legitimately the case, then we would have to deal with it. But it's not the case. And so instead, that sort of narrative can feed the very same sort of sense of hopelessness and aimlessness that outright denial of the science can lead to. It leads us to the same place. If you really don't believe that there's any agency on our part in averting catastrophic climate change, then why act? Then why do anything? Then why, change our way of life? And so I have become increasingly concerned that indefensibly doomist portrayal of where we are and where we're going can actually lead to the very same sort of policy paralysis, that outright climate change denialism leads to. And I'm concerned that there are some messengers who almost seem to have been co-opted by the climate change denialists, because that narrative, if there's nothing we can do about it, then it leads us to the same place. Why move it? Now, I'm not saying that that's what David was doing.
Please, no.
But I think
we're going to all be friends when we're ending. This will end.
We're ending. What about right now?
Yeah,
but that's the context. It's important to understand that context, because that's the context into which I was sort of interpreting, David's piece.
But now, do you see yourself as a messenger? Do you see advocacy as part of your portfolio?
Well,
is that your problem?
It's a really complicated question to answer. I mean, I do feel now that I have that role.
Which?
As a part-time advocate.
Okay.
I think, in a much smaller scale way than Michael's experience, but that I have been.
I think we are advocates. Who should have to apologize for advocating for a fact-based discourse over what is potentially the greatest threat that we face as a civilization? Why should we have to apologize for being advocates for that?
Yeah, I agree. But I would say, to your point, agency is really, really important. And I may have a slightly perverse view of this, but when I see the story of climate change told, I don't have despair. I don't fall into fatalism. I was just actually doing a panel last night that was called Hope and Despair. And I think that when you see the story of what's happened, you realize that we are all the authors of those effects. And it's not, it's not a 300-year story, although the 300 years has had an impact. It is in a really profound way the story of just the last couple of decades. We're now at a point where we've emitted more carbon into the atmosphere since Al Gore wrote his first book on climate than in the entire history of humanity before that. And if you think that we've now brought our planet to where it is, just with those, say, 25, or if you want to think about it as a 50 or 75-year period, that's then you cast forward and you think, we have that amount of time to undo that damage, to stall the effects. And when I see evidence of climate impacts unfolding really large scale, it's horrifying, it's tragic, it's scary, it's depressing. But it also reminds me that we are capable as authors of that degradation to undo it or to stop it. And I think that the proper response to seeing the damage that we've done is not to say it's all over, we might as well pack up and go home. It's to say this is proof that we actually are in control of this planet. We are the ones who made this issue. It's not an asteroid that's come from outer space and hit us. We are its authors, and we can continue to be its authors going forward. Obviously, no matter what we do, there's going to be some more suffering, some more degradation. But what stands between us now in 2017 and the worst case scenarios that I sketched out in my piece is almost entirely a matter of human agency. It's what we do collectively as a planet in responding to this crisis. And personally, I have some different perspective on this than some climate activists, some climate scientists. I do think that fear is an important part of our motivating toolkit. That if people think that everything is going to be okay, they may not take the kinds of actions that they need to take. And as I look around, talk to my friends, talk to my colleagues, walk around the city, in general, again, just working through this sort of culture of well-off Western consumer culture, it seems really obvious to me that we're at risk of being too complacent, and that the risk of being too scared it just seems silly to me to think about becoming too scared. Now, I know there are a lot of activists who, have given up hope. It can be a really despairing situation to be in, and people who've devoted themselves to the cause, seeing very little progress, have dropped out. I know that's a real phenomenon among advocates and activists, but when I think about the broader public, I think that there are many more people who can be more turned on by climate fear than turned off. And I think the surveys are pointed in a bunch of different directions. You can read them in a bunch of different ways, but personally I see the data as supporting that. There are a lot of people, I think the number is something like 70%, who are concerned, who think global warming is real and are concerned about it in the US. But very few of them make it a top priority in their lives or in their political decisions. And for me, the main job of answering this threat is getting those people to be concerned about it as a kind of first order issue. And I think that, as I said, fear is a kind of a part of the toolkit for helping them.
So in a very real sense, the data that you create as a scientist, you and your colleagues, is the raw material for what he and I and others in this room do when we write about these issues. And so given that you spend an appreciable portion of your time also, wearing our hat and reaching out, I'm curious how you balance what Stephen Schneider used to call the double ethical bind.
Sure.
How do you balance being effective against being honest as a scientist?
Yeah, it's it's amazing. Steve Schneider was sort of the Carl Sagan of our field. He was a great climate scientist, but he was a great science communicator, and we lost him, I guess about now almost 10 years ago. Yeah. And it was great loss to those of us who, for whom Steve had served as a mentor and as as really a figure of, who conveyed that you can both do science and participate in the public sphere and inform the public about the implications of that science, and there's nothing wrong in doing that. And there's a quote that is often taken out of context to try to malign Steve. He was used to try to discredit him when he talked about inventing scary stories. So the double bind that you're referring to, there's a quote where he said, we have to capture the public's imagination, so we invent scary stories, but I forget the rest of it, but we have to be truthful to what the science has to say. And that's sort of what he really meant. And in the end, at the end of that quote, he said, I hope that we can be both honest and effective. That is what he saw as what we need to strive for. He wasn't actually saying that we should invent scenarios that aren't faithful to the science. But what he was saying was that it is important for us to be faithful to the science and be effective at the same time, because our opponents aren't bound by that same double bind. They're not bound by the code of ethics that scientists observe, and they don't have to be faithful to the truth. And they're allowed to exaggerate and misrepresent.
Here's what he said.
Yep, great, yep.
Like most people, we'd like to see the world a better place, which in this context translates into our working to reduce the risk of potentially disastrous climatic change. To do that, we need to get some broad-based support to capture the public's imagination, and that, of course, entails getting loads of media coverage. So we have to cough up scary scenarios to make simplified, dramatic statements and make little mention of any doubts we might have. This double ethical blind we frequently find ourselves in cannot be solved by any formula. Each of us has to decide the right balance between being effective and being honest. I hope that means being both. So what I want to know is, how do you, Michael, juggle that?
So, as I said, so we are bound, one of those double binds doesn't apply to the other side, to climate change, deniers, those who attack the science and try to undermine the public understanding of the science, don't have to be faithful to the science. They don't have to tell the truth. We do. So you might say, well, that puts us at a disadvantage, but I honestly don't think it does, because we have one very important thing on our side, which is scientific truth. And in the end, I believe that we can be both faithful to the science and effective. And David and I think, are in agreement, on the vast sort of on much of what we've been discussing. We're in agreement. We're in agreement on the fact that you can't just talk about the most likely, the center of the bell curve. You do have to talk about the tail of that curve, the things that are unlikely, but if they happen, would be hugely costly, would be catastrophic. And Steve Schneider himself was passionate about that, about the importance of describing those unlikely worst-case scenarios, and characterizing it in the same way we might characterize fire insurance. We don't buy fire insurance, and this was the example Steve would often use, and it was a very effective example. We don't buy fire insurance for our homes because we think our homes are going to burn down. That isn't the most likely scenario. It's a low probability scenario. But if it were to happen, it would be catastrophic to us. It would be life-changing, life-ruining, and so we take steps to mitigate against that by purchasing fire insurance. Even though we know it's an unlikely thing, we still pay money now to insure against that, to hedge against that outcome.
Right.
In the analogy being, of course, that mitigation, reducing carbon emissions, acting on climate change, that's a planetary insurance policy.
Sure. And we are in the business of selling.
There you are.
So insurance. So we ask a variation of the question of you.
Well, can I just respond?
Yes, please.
I mean, I think it even goes beyond that, in the sense that when you talk about fire insurance, you're talking about the likelihood that a fire is going to burn down your home. And that's a binary situation. Either a fire is going to strike or it's not. And the thing about climate, and what the bell curve really shows you on climate change, is that for every little tick upward of temperature, all of these things are going to get considerably worse. So when you talk about, say, the 5% likely outcome, it's not just a matter of preparing for something that we have a 1 in 20 chance of getting to. It's the fact that that whole slope of that curve is going to map out more and more dangerous scenarios, and that so we need to be even more prepared for those possibilities than we would if we were just saying, oh, we have a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting to this point.
Yeah, like all analogies, it's an imperfect one, and you're absolutely right. People often will ask you, they ask me, and I'm sure they ask you, what's the tipping point? How much warming before we hit the tipping point? The answer is there is no one tipping point. That's not the way it works. It's not binary. We don't go off a cliff. A much better analogy is we're walking out onto a minefield, and the farther we walk out onto that minefield, the greater likelihood that we set off those explosives.
So I guess what I want to ask you is it really, and I don't know how else to put it, so I'll just say, an accurate and honest journalistic depiction of risk. I mean, you're really being honest and straight with readers about risk of a particular possibility in climate change. If you only focus on the worst case scenario. Now, I understand the theater of what you were doing, but
well, I would say I don't think that anybody should form their full picture of climate change based on my article at all. I was trying to fill what I saw as a hole in the storytelling apparatus in that side of the risk tale. And I did say in the piece, several times, these are worst case scenarios. I think it's unlikely that we ever get to them and all those kind of caveats. But I do think it's important for us to understand that portion of the risk, of the tail risk. But yeah, I don't think it's a complete picture, and I wouldn't want anybody to form their whole view of things based on it.
do you think in part, and then we have a question here, in part that you were that hole, I'll call it a hole, in sort of the public knowledge about the truly awful consequences, was in part a result of scientific reticence. Many scientists who present the scenario thing like to dwell at the median because, well, it has the air of reasonableness.
And this is something I've been critical of myself. So, yeah, critical of scientists who are overly reticent in how they go about characterizing the science and its impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, that's part of it. Scientific temperament is one thing, but there's also just, many scientists don't have storytelling tools that a journalist has, and sometimes they don't see the opportunities for storytelling about climate that someone else might see. I think there's also the effect of, many people, Michael is as I said before, a real hero for how he's done battle with the deniers, but there are also people who've been chastened by that experience, and even if they haven't done battle with it themselves, seeing their colleagues do battle with it, it's made them more and more cautious, which as scientists isn't necessarily a bad thing. If they want to be absolutely sure about what they're publishing, then that's good. That's what their jobs are. That's what their work is meant to be. But my perspective is, if some scenario is good enough to be published in the best scientific journals, really it should be good enough to share with the public, and we should trust the public to process it in a responsible way. I think journalists want to help the reader along and maybe not give them, maybe not spare them important context that make them feel a little safer. But in general, if there's news out of science that's being published in really credentialed publications, I think it's worth sharing more widely.
Professor Fagan, I give you the privilege of the floor.
Okay, this is exciting. First of all, thank you both very much. This is a great discussion because and I guess I really wanted to follow up on Lee's last question and see if I can get you guys to expound a little more and maybe a little more deeply on the journalist version of Schneider's double bind, which is that, yes, we're in this business because we think that journalism has a use and that journalism can be a positive force for solving societal problems, for progressing. On the other hand, our first obligation, at least as I see it, is to reflect reality. So those of us who've been writing about environmental risk for decades, and climate risk is the most existential of those environmental risks, I think are really torn up about this problem of how to do it right. And I salute David for his piece because I think that all pieces of the bell curve should be written about, especially the middle section that's most likely, and the most extreme, because that's where the consequences are the highest. My problem with David's piece is that I felt like my problem was not that it was gloomy. We're in the reality reflecting business. That's our lane. My problem was much more that I felt like while you had some sort of boilerplate in there about likelihood, it felt sort of tossed in, and it certainly wasn't part of the overall framing of the piece. And beyond that, there wasn't much about time. There wasn't a lot of information about, is this happening in 5 years? Is this happening in a century? You had it in there, but it wasn't at the core of the piece. And so it violated some of the rules that I've been teaching in reporting about risk, in that, in my view, it was inadequately contextualized for, I think, very good reasons. You are operating from the frustration that many of us feel, that giving risk in all its nuance rarely moves people. But I wonder if now, in retrospect, after you've read all the commentary, whether, David, you feel like, yeah, if I was doing it again, I might have been a little more explicit about likelihood and timescale. And if you had done that, do you think it would have diminished the impact of the piece? Thanks.
Well, thank you. I wish I had said it earlier.
Right.
Dan, thanks for hosting us. Thanks to NYU. Thanks to both of you too. Yeah. Well, the short answer is I actually do think I was pretty good about timescale on the piece. I was pretty clear that I was talking about scenarios unfolding between now and 2100. On the question of likelihoods, it's complicated. I mean, the factors that go into determining which of these scenarios or how far along the track on each of these scenarios we get, and at what point, as I mentioned before, most of those factors are human. There is scientific uncertainty around some of that, and I often think that casual readers use uncertainty as an excuse to focus on the sunnier half of the story and not worry about the darker possibilities. But to talk about whether we're going to get to, say, 3 degrees warming at 2050, at 2100, at 2200, those questions are almost entirely to be determined by the actions that we take going forward. And I think, therefore, very, very hard to talk about in any kind of concrete terms. So what I said in the piece was the UN projects that if we do not take action on carbon emissions, that we will get to about 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And they think that there's about a 5% chance that if that happens, we get to about 8 degrees of warming. I said that super explicitly, and it was those two benchmarks were important in each of the sections that I went through to talk about the effect on agriculture, the effect on public health, the effect on some of the most interesting work to me is about economic growth and conflict, which is also new research that may evolve a lot over the next few years. But and I think beyond that, it's a little hard to talk about probabilities. This isn't, I mean, I'm very curious to know how Michael feels about this, but for me, it was very hard to think, can I say this is like a 25% chance of happening by this year? Is this a 37% chance? Any numbers like that I saw in any writing about climate seemed to me really arbitrary, because all of the major factors, or I shouldn't say all, most of the major factors have to do with how we respond, what action we take on carbon emissions, and other technological solutions that we may come up with. And it's really hard to talk about those, in any concrete way.
So yeah, I'm curious too, Michael, what your response is.
I am as well.
Because he's making a very good point, which is that now that the largest variable is human, as a journalist who covers these things, I mean, how am I supposed to sort of,
navigate
balance and feed that in? Like, should I, should the third paragraph be, but you don't really have to worry about this because, well, most of the time we rally at the last minute and do something creative and fix the problem. We don't know what it is here, but I'm sure something, and then move on. I mean, how do we temper this, or should we?
Yeah, I mean, so if
humanity and time.
Well, if there was one central critique that I had advanced at the time on David's piece, it was that I wasn't convinced that it did do as good a job as I would have liked of distinguishing between the likely impacts and the worst case scenarios, and that's difficult to do, and I just wasn't sure that the reader would be able to go back and forth and keep that all in perspective. But in David's defense, that's a really difficult thing to do. These are difficult waters to navigate for a scientist or a journalist, because you're dealing, first of all, with the challenge that I think is at the center of what David is trying to do here. If you ask a scientist, how would you like to present information to stakeholders and policymakers? They would tell you, well, I would produce a probability distribution of the variable of interest, and I would have them calculate, where in that probability distribution they're willing to be and what the likelihood is of achieving that. The way a scientist would go about it is not the way any normal human being would go about it. And so what we need to do is to figure out ways to convey that sort of information in a way that's accessible and digestible to somebody who is not versed in the technical jargon and formalisms of science. And one of the ways we do that, we can't give somebody a probability distribution curve and expect them to know what to do with that. But we can try to give them what we think are the key points along that curve. And that's what David's talking about. Well, you have to tell them what the mean is, or the median, sort of the center, but you have to give some sense of the tail of that distribution, the low likelihood but potentially catastrophic outcomes. And then you deal with the fact that there are at least two fundamentally different kinds of uncertainties here. There's the uncertainty that we control, what we choose to do, and there's the scientific uncertainty. Given our best scientific understanding of the climate system, there are still uncertainties in the way clouds behave in a warmer climate, in how El Nino will operate, on what will happen to hurricanes and tornadoes. There's enough scientific uncertainty as well that there are almost equal amounts of both. If you look at if you try to parse the uncertainty in future projections of global warming, about half that uncertainty is sort of what we call scenario uncertainty. It's what we choose to do. What path do we follow in our burning of fossil fuels, in our pursuit of renewable energy? And about half of that uncertainty is fundamentally scientific. We can't reduce that through human behavior. We just have to deal with the fact that we are making decisions in the face of uncertainty. But it brings us back to the same point. When you are making decisions in the face of uncertainty, you do need to keep in mind those low probability catastrophic outcomes. And David and I are in complete agreement with that. And it's really important to communicate that to policymakers and stakeholders. And one of my main critiques of the scientific community actually has been not properly conveying those potential outcomes. So we're much more in agreement than we are in disagreement here. And for me, it was simply a matter of how clear it was when we were talking about one and when we were talking about the other. But should we be communicating those worst case scenarios? Absolutely. I think it would be a dereliction of responsibility on the part of climate scientists and journalists to not do that.
Oh, I should say, I think your differences are in a sense stylistic, and the stylistic difference is journalism versus science. I mean,
I would just say two things to build off what Michael was saying. The first is, goes back to we were talking about the fire insurance analogy, which is that, if there's a 5% chance that we get to, 7 degrees of warming or 6 degrees of warming by the end of the century, that percentage chance is important to understand, but it's not like if we don't get it, we're going to be at 1 degree of warming where we are now. So talking in this context about worst case scenarios is not just about teaching the unlikely but possible and quite catastrophic effects. It's also showing the whole slope. I think that's a really important point. So whether my article or other articles sort of overstate the possibility that we could end up in some really extreme scenarios is one question kind of for scientific debate, but in terms of what readers will get from it, if they learn that we're on a slope in terms of heat stress that could lead to parts of the world being so hot that you couldn't really exercise outside without having heat stroke in the next 50 or 75 years, whether they think that possibility is 5 or 10 or 1%, is on some level to me a little less important than knowing that we're on that slope to begin with. And that connects to the second additional point I would make, which is that my article really stopped at 2100, and a lot of people writing about climate do that because it's really easy for people to understand. But like the Earth is going to be around for many centuries going forward.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's the theory, right? Yeah.
And
That's the best case scenario.
And especially when we talk about sea level rise, I mean, you know, we're going to have a lot of sea level rise if we take a perspective of many millennia. And sort of freezing the story so it ends at 2100 is really actually misleading in some basic way.
And yet it's difficult to get people to care about something that's even 20 years in the future.
Yeah. But I care about this person who's been very patient with the question.
That's quite all right. So my question has to do with, you guys seem to have come to some sort of very lovely, honestly, really lovely agreement over this piece, and it's been quite nice to hear about.
Isn't it disappointing?
However, I'm curious about the aftermath of publishing this story.
Yes,
I'm
thank
curious
you.
about the annotations that you ended up publishing.
you.
I'm curious about Dr. Mann's Facebook post, and
Yeah.
essentially, what was your initial reaction to reading the piece, and what was your initial reaction to the popularity of the piece and then the ensuing reaction? And then, just because I really want to make sure I get this other question in, for Dr. Mann specifically, I'd like to know how much of the worry of climate scientists as a whole about talking about these worst case scenarios has to do with probability, and how much of it has to do with the worry that you will be perceived as fear-mongering. And you know, because I work on climate science for a living, and I'm just wondering, when I talk to climate scientists about these worst case scenarios, how much of their hesitancy has to do with probability, and how much of it has to do with just the being accused of just overblowing the facts?
Two really good questions, and I may ask you to come back and ask the second one again.
That's fine.
Pushback.
You want me to start?
I think that's probably a good way to do it.
Okay.
So, because you did she asked a question, something I wanted to go into, which I thank you for, which is, as a publication, you and the magazine did a series of things after the piece ran. I'd like you to tell us what the magazine did in response to whatever reaction you got, what that reaction was, and how you dealt with it. And we'll ask you some more.
Well, the reaction was, first of all, overwhelming and deeply flattering. I mean, that was my basic experience of it was, first of all, the scale. So many readers. I was mentioning this to Michael earlier, but you know, we're trained in this business to think of climate as a kind of traffic kryptonite, and the story was the opposite. And I think that's really actually encouraging for the cause, in addition to just being exciting as a writer to see. And you know, most of the response that I got from readers was, again, quite positive, and it felt really flattering. There are a lot of people who were saying, you know, I had some vague intuitions that the picture of climate change that I'd been fed was a little too optimistic, and this gave me some concrete sense of really where things are. The response from scientists was more mixed than that, for sure, but I also heard from a lot of scientists who were quite appreciative, some of whom I'd interviewed and others who I hadn't. And yeah, and then there were those who were critical of the piece, including Michael. Michael, I think, was one of the first who wrote about it in that Facebook post. And that experience was interesting in the sense that there were sort of two different sets of issues. There were some factual questions that were raised, you know, most of which I think actually were like that a couple facts that weren't presented with the right context. They weren't exactly wrong, but they were just not presented to the reader in as responsible a way as they may have been, and we changed that quickly. And then there was a sort of much bigger phenomenon of scientists like Michael, including Michael, who criticized the broader framing of the piece. And that seemed to me like a really interesting and important debate to have, how to talk about these issues. I was a little frustrated that those two critiques were sort of combined in a lot of places where there was writing about it. It was like scientific community like takes issue with the piece, which was true in a sense, but was mostly about the framing, I think, really rather than the facts. And so, especially to answer that and to focus the conversation on the question of framing and rhetoric and what kinds of writing about climate are responsible, we said, well, we know that every sentence in this article was, you know, came from somewhere. it was, went through a rigorous fact checking like everything we do does. And we thought, well, why not just put that out there and show our work, which is, it sort of seems intuitive, but it's actually a kind of unprecedented thing for a journalist to do at a magazine like New York, anyway. And so we rushed together. I had great help of brilliant fact checker Julia Mead and my editor David Haskell. Like, we basically sprinted for 3 days and put together this annotation, and published it along with a couple of the kind of corrections and clarifications that we had that had been raised. And I think that was really important on a number of levels, but primarily because it allowed the ensuing conversation to really focus on this question of how we should talk about these issues, not whether this article was factually sound, but how we should talk about what we know about the worst case scenarios. And I think that's basically been the tone of to the extent that there's been an ongoing debate in the months since, has been really focused on that question, which I've been happy to see and excited to be participating in tonight.
I was very intrigued when you all did that, and that you, for those of you who didn't see that, they basically published, or republished, I guess, better way to put it, a version of the article, and didn't change any of the language, but they did what you can do on the internet, which is create a document in depth with annotations that took you straight to the sources for sentence by sentence. And they published, I was particularly interested in this, a lot of the outtakes, full interviews with people who'd been scientists and other sources who had contributed to the article, but instead of seeing the one quote that was used or whatever, you saw the 45-minute conversation, and you saw how the thing had been explored and the sort of like the trees from which the 2x4s had been made. And I thought that was very interesting.
We were actually planning on doing that before we published the piece. It
Really?
wasn't a response to the response, but it ended up being an interesting part of the week.
So your half of the question, so this thing appears on the newsstand. I mean, why are you responding to the story in the New York Magazine in the first place? It's not like your normal thing. What hit your nerve? I mean, what other than his exquisite writing? But
I mean, it was very well written. I'm pretty active, in engaging with sort of the larger public discourse on climate change, and so I frequently do comment on stories that that appear that deal with the topic of climate change. And David's was certainly a very prominent one, and it's one that I had contributed. I had interviewed with him, so I was very interested to see the story when it appeared. And again, one of my disappointments is the way that it is difficult to have the sort of nuanced discussion we're having here in public, online, in social media. Things tend to devolve into highly opinionated and often animated disagreements and debates. And one of the things that happens is, I express some initial concerns or misgivings, and then there were others out there who attacked me for doing that, and I had to defend, why that I had those misgivings. So I had to actually go into more detail. I had to and that actually fed this rift. It was the process of others sort of coming in and adding to the feeding frenzy that I think led to the appearance of a much greater rift between David and me than actually exists. And I still feel, I feel bad about that, because it did, I think, it detracted from the larger important message that David's piece
Well, I should just say
carried.
that, the fact that anybody of Michael's stature, but including many other scientists who were engaging with my work, was hugely gratifying and flattering. Even if they were taking issue with some of it, I found the whole experience of being engaged in a public debate with these people really exciting, and I'm excited to be continuing to have that conversation.
Yeah, well, same here, and I guess my feeling was that that I did talk both about the framing and about some of the science that I thought was somewhat selective, like on the methane feedbacks and on sort of the satellite record. There were certain things where I felt like the framing of the science actually did sort of serve the narrative, the larger narrative of things potentially being worse, more dire than we thought. And so I didn't see a clear separation between sort of some of the issues of the science and whether it was right
So
and the
part of your
framing.
role, you felt part of your public role as a scientist writing was to be a corrective.
Yeah, but not just carping at details, because I don't think that serves anybody's goal here. I was sort of, I think David and I are both similar in that we do have. We're both interested in the larger picture. We're both interested in, does this serve the public discourse? Does this inform this very important discussion? Yeah.
You guys are the public discourse.
Well, we were for a week.
And so is this gentleman here who's been very patient. You have a question, sir?
Yeah, just to make sure I'm communicating effectively, just a show of hands, how many people here are feeling frustrated? They'd like to hear more about solutions, because I don't want to waste your time if you're not. Just only.
Well, it's good. I should tell you, sir,
Only
that
4 people.
our interest here and the purpose of this symposium is communication, although we're always happy to hear about solutions to communication.
Okay.
But if you have something that
Well,
you'd
I
like
want
to...
to make sure I'm communicating people's wants and needs, so I want to
Of
make
course,
sure.
of course.
Because I'm a tech activist, I'm a PhD psychologist, but I'm a tech activist. I'm a head of a startup that's focusing on solutions. And there's 2 premises before I give you my question. One premise is a quote from Kurt Vonnegut, which is, if you know your history, American history, he said, in the battle between the forces of good and evil, greed and compassion, there's only one thing that's ever made the difference, that's organizing. And I think it's obvious when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about greed, unfettered capitalism. The other premise is that if the major grassroots organizations are going to have any success in the very near future to be able to recruit the vast larger numbers of people they need to actually do much bigger tasks, from willing to get arrested at a pipeline to willing to knock on 200 doors on a weekend to get the right person elected, we're going to need some way of solving that problem. I call it the mother of all challenges. What can we do to get a lot more people willing to join groups to do a lot bigger things than just show up at a protest, which really doesn't do much, or even call a couple of members of Congress, although you all better call your members of Congress tonight about this GOP tax scam. But the question is, so we're developing an app that solves that problem. And I'd just like to know, before, I'm not here to tout our app, but we have 2 co-founder positions.
Okay.
What
But
do
your
you
question
think? My
is-
question is, what have you come across in your writings that has excited you about some new ways to organize that could solve this mother of all challenges, that could recruit a lot more people to do a lot more courageous tasks? We have a solution to that, but I'd like to know what your ideas are, what you've come across, what you've heard that give you some hope.
I would just say it's interesting, most of the people who've asked me about what they can do in the aftermath of my piece have really been focused on personal consumption choices.
I call that the lifestyle delusion.
I actually am totally with you, and I feel like what I always say is really organizing is the thing to do.
Right.
That the difference is made by individual lifestyle. It's good to live in a responsible way, but that political organization is overwhelmingly the thing that's going to solve the problem, if we're going to solve the problem.
That begs the question, how can we organize a lot more cleverly in a lot bigger way?
Well, personally, I think that, first of all, I think the climate is doing a lot of the work for us. I mean, I think if you look at what's happened over the last 6 months, the extreme weather, the hurricanes, the wildfires, I do think that the public is really waking up to climate change in a much more profound way than they ever have before. And I think it's important to keep in mind, given what I was saying earlier about the incredible speed with which we've created this problem, that there's also, the fact that the public is aware at all and turned on at all should be, on some level, a cause for hope rather than a cause for despair. It wasn't all that long ago that not many people even knew really what was involved in climate change. And now, everyone I know knows about carbon emissions, knows about, parts per million, and that awareness and that engagement, I think, is only going to grow, especially as we start to see more and more of the really scary effects.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I would underscore some of those points. You take something like gun control, there's overwhelming support among the American people, upwards of 90% support for common sense gun legislation, and yet we have a gerrymandered Congress which is unwilling to do anything about the problem. And so public acceptance and even public concern in the political system that we operate in today isn't always sufficient. It's necessary, but not necessarily sufficient for political change.
We know what Dante said about
Okay.
those who know.
We got a line.
Okay.
I have to ask two things. One, I have to ask our guests to stay focused on our viewers online, resist the cognitive magnetic attraction of a real human being. And next question.
Well, I just want to say if anybody does want to look at a really
Right.
amazing solution, ours is called Kickstarter plus peer-to-peer bonding meets movement organizing. We have 2 co-founder openings in CME. It's called winwisely.org.
And when this session is over, I'm sure there are a lot of us would be interested in talking to you about it.
Winwisely.org.
Yeah, thank you for that. Please, next question.
I have a very simple question about communication. So, Michael, in your response to the article, you made the point that David didn't quote you, that he interviewed you, but he did not quote you. And so I'm wondering, were you really pissed off about that? And David, I'm wondering, I'm wondering from you, what made you decide to, not include Michael in the article?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I don't remember the context for that, so I can't really say. I was overwhelmingly much less concerned about my own personal exposure. I have enough of that. And my concerns were much more just about whether the framing was right. I mean, David and I are both interested in the same thing, in seeing sort of public acceptance and that guiding policy towards acting on this problem. And my concerns were really whether this article would serve that purpose optimally.
So, David, just as a kind of technical matter, because a number of us here are either students of journalism or working journalists, how do you feel about the direct quotation? I mean, if you've talked to 50 people, some people feel like, well, I should quote something from all 50 of them to prove to my readers that I talked to all these people. What's your stance? How do you feel? If you can digest it better than they can say it, shouldn't you do that?
Well, usually a quote is better than an author's summary, but it's also the case that in a lot of reporting, you're doing interviews that are, much bigger picture conversations than you're going to want to actually detail in the story itself, or you go off on a tangent and you end up talking about something that ends up being not a big part of the story, or the person happened to really talk around one point and was not quite clear in what they said. And I think there are a lot of reasons for not quoting someone who you interview, and on some level I think it's a sign of the strength of the reporting, the more people who are not quoted, because it just means the ratio of people you've interviewed to the people who show up in the piece, the higher that is, probably the more informed you are, and the more informed you are in your thinking, in your writing, in your structuring of the whole story.
So it's really, one of the things that they beat into us, of course, is that it's one of the really important things for a journalist to communicate to his or her readers is, how do you know what you know? So if you were boiling down, and as we all do, that many interviews, and the sourcing you did was quite impressive. How do you signal to the reader that, I've talked to a lot of people, and I know what I'm talking about here,
One way is just to say exactly that, which I did, which is a bit of a hacky move, but I said, over the last few months, I've interviewed dozens of climate scientists, blah, blah, blah. And another way was to publish these independent interviews, which we did that week, to at least highlight, I think it was only 5 or 6, but to highlight some really substantive, interesting, thoughtful conversations with a number of high-profile people, not all of whom were in agreement with each other or in agreement with me, but who gave a sense of the kind of reporting landscape that I was wandering on.
Yeah. You have a question. Been patient?
I do. So this piece got so much attention, and that means that the audience that saw it became enormous. I do a lot of work in conservation biology, and I'm aware that when I'm speaking, about half the people are already on board with what I'm saying, and the other half don't care at all. So in this context, I think you did a great job scaring people who already believe that climate change is real, and as you said, they might not know how bad it could be, but they're in. how do you respond to the other group, the people, how do you respond to the climate denialists who use your piece and some of the scientific pushback against it as proof that this entire issue is something overblown, that the media has overstepped and created a panic state?
Well, I think I may differ slightly from Michael on this, but my feeling is that the more pressing problem when it comes to kind of climate communications is making those people who are open to the possibility of action on climate much more committed to that project. That, you know, if you look at the data and say that, you know, 65-70% of America believes that climate change is real and concerning, if you could get all of those people to be really, really animated by climate change, that's more important than persuading 10 or 15% of people on the margin that it's something to worry about if they're only going to start worrying about it in a very low-level way. But one other thing I would say in response to that, not so much about fear, but just the general messaging question, I think we do often, we're a little narcissistic as Americans in thinking that the solution to this problem and the whole question really resides in our democracy. And while it's certainly true and important that Americans take action on, you know, this is something we need to take better action on than we have, it's also the case that overwhelmingly the problem is going to be solved elsewhere in the world, really by China and India, secondarily by Western Europe, and you know, that the global question is a really different question than the American political question. We have an unusual case of climate denialism here. There are a lot of factors standing in the way of good climate action abroad, but they're not nearly as organized or as strong as they are in the US. And I think we sometimes get a little too focused on the question of, you know, Republican intransigence, and I think that can get in the way of a kind of clear-eyed view of the big picture and what's important.
So if I may paraphrase the question just a little bit for you, Michael. So from where you sit as a scientist / communicator, do you get concerned that a frank and open discussion and frank and open reporting of climate issues or a particular scenario or that scenario, that might be great and laudable in some respects, but it also just turns up a lot of fodder for the denialist community, and so therefore it's kind of working at cross purposes?
No, I don't. You know, I think we have to be willing to have frank discussions with each other in public. I think it's important for the public, for our audience, to have a sense of the sorts of discussions that do go on within the scientific community, because our detractors have created a caricature, right, that we're all, you know, climate scientists, we're all just reaffirming each other's work and this narrative of climate threat so that we can continue to get government funds. And we agree with each other, and there's no debate and there's no dissension because we're all just trying to advance a common narrative of climate threat. And that brings in, you know, and the irony, of course, is that many who are leveling that accusation actually are getting quite a bit of money for arguing against the science. Scientists get ahead. The way you get ahead in science, the way you get an article in one of the leading journals, Nature or Science, is by presenting something new, something we didn't already know. It isn't by simply saying, oh yeah, you know, the other guy or the other woman was right. Everybody else has already, you know, figured it out. That's not how you get a government grant to do new research. It's not how you get an article in one of the leading journals. So there is this give and take. There's this good faith debate and real skepticism, not fake skepticism, like those who call themselves climate change skeptics, but real skepticism is what Carl Sagan called the self-correcting machinery that guides science forward. And it's important for the public to see that that's what real skepticism is, that's how real scientists operate, that we're not afraid of uncertainties. Uncertainty is where interesting science resides. The corpus of known scientific knowledge, we don't just go over that again and again. Where we do our research, where we spend our time is at the periphery, the boundaries of the science, the things that we're not certain about. I think the more that we can make it clear to the public that that's the way science works, the more the public understands the actual culture of science and how science really works, the more difficult it is for those looking to malign the science and to malign the scientists, to build up this straw man, this caricature of the way science is and what the way science works.
So I think we lost our question there, to which I regret, but perhaps it'll resurface. I'm curious now, the kind of lessons learned aspect of this. Some of us are beginners, some of us could certainly use someone's advice about how to keep going and how to do this effectively. So I'm curious now, first from you, David, as someone who came to this topic as a relative neophyte, if I can use that word. What have you learned as a result of this reporting experience that you would then package as advice to someone who was coming to it for the first time?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is not advice, which is just that I would not again use methane release from permafrost as a way to illustrate the uncertainties.
You'd use methane release from livestock, I guess, which
Yeah.
is, the new one that we're all remeasuring.
Well, I think that the publication of that annotation was really helpful, and I think that going forward, it could be a really exciting new model for how to do this kind of work. Academics do exactly this when they publish, and given the internet, journalists could do it too, to really, really show where everything that they're working on is coming from. I think that, to some of the points that Michael made when he was writing about it originally, and to some of the points made in this room tonight, I think that it's probably important to keep in mind, some of the broader context of probabilities and likelihood, and also keep in mind that readers may not be reading quite as carefully as you are writing, and so to be really clear and unmistakably clear about, if you're writing about worst case scenarios, exactly what that means, and then to the extent that you can, really show your work.
Yeah, that's interesting. We have two questions, but I want to just quickly hear your answer to the same question from the other side. A number of people here are scientists who are interested in kind of taking the path you have taken as a communicator while trying to sort of do their real work. Right. And what advice would you give them? Well, in the same vein.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, not all scientists should be science communicators. Many should not be. Many of us are most content, or happiest, and most productive, in the laboratory doing the science, and that's great. But some of us need to leave the laboratory. I do think it's important that the voice of science enters into the larger discussion. And I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a few years ago, the title of which was, "If you see something, say something." And the point of that op-ed was that if scientists, if we retreat from the public sphere, then we leave a vacuum that's going to be filled by other voices, voices of those who are not disinterested, who have an axe to grind, who have an agenda to advance. And so it is important for us to be part of the conversation. In my own view, I don't think that my place is to try to prescribe what the solutions should be, but to inform the discussions of the threats, the risks that exist, and the solutions that exist. So, if our Congress today was debating a carbon tax versus cap and trade, and the nature of incentives for renewable energy, rather than debating whether or not climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese, to me that would be that's where our discussion needs to be. What's the role of nuclear energy in the transition away from fossil fuels? These are legitimate things to be debating, but is climate change real? Does it represent a threat? There is no longer a legitimate debate to be had about that, and we do need to get past it. And let me make one more point, because it ties into something we were talking about before. I do think that it is important for the U.S. to continue to play a prominent role in global negotiations to solve this problem. Who are we to tell, the Chinas and the Indias, we've had, 2 centuries of access to cheap fossil fuel energy, and we built our nations of great wealth on that. And who are we to tell India and China that they're not entitled to that same source of cheap energy if we don't have our own house in order, if we are not doing everything that we can to solve the problem? So I do think it is important that the U.S. continue to play a
Indeed.
prominent role.
And who am I to tell these two people that we're not going to have time to get to their questions?
Good
so
point.
please.
Thank you, both heroes of mine, Dr. Mann and David. I'm curious from the journalist side, is there a way that what can be done to allow journalists to talk more openly about this, about the extreme scenarios? And then from the scientific side, what Dr. Mann would it have helped to have David talked more about the solutions, such as the victory plan that I that you've advised us on? Yeah.
Well, I don't think that, to answer the first question first, I don't think that there's much standing in the way of journalists doing whatever it is that they want to do.
But then why hasn't it happened then?
I think a lot. I mean, it's a complicated question. It's a complicated question to answer. I think part of it has to do with the simple fact that I wrote the article that I wrote in part because I was coming at it new, as we talked about, and I was able to really take in the full scope of things. And I think many of the people who are most engaged and serious as climate reporters are doing a serial job of that. And I actually do think that if you read those people quite closely, you get a similar picture of extreme scenarios over time. It's just that the nature of their work is such that it's divided up over many pieces over a long period of time and really takes some focus to see the big picture.
And the second half of the question for you?
Yeah, sort of a variant on the same theme. I don't think it's the place of the scientists to tell journalists what they should write about and how they should write about it. I think our role is to make sure that that those pieces are as informed as they can be. Again, about what the science has to say, about what the risks are, about what the solutions are. To me, that's the sweet spot when I think of the role that I as a scientist can play in this discussion.
And just one quick note about solutions, it's an oversimplification, but I think it's true that there is one solution, and that is like curbing carbon emissions. We know that. There are a lot of other ways we can go about addressing the problem, but it's not as though this is a mystery. What we need to do is get our carbon emissions under control, and the main thing that's going to change that is public policy choices. And the things that's going to drive that is public activism and organization.
And going to the voting booth
Yeah.
during those midterm
right there?
elections.
Hi, yeah, actually kind of piggybacking on that last comment of you needing mass public motivation for this change. David, it's interesting that one of the most powerful examples in your piece relies on people who are already feeling the effects of this climate change, people who are field workers. But you already said in the beginning that this was written for people of your audience, New York Magazine readers. There's not a huge overlap of people who work in fields and are feeling the effects of climate change now in New York Magazine readers. And if you need people to motivate or to mobilize and get involved, we need a bigger outreach. And there has to be a way to get this message to individuals who are already feeling the effects now and will feel them strongest in the years to come. So I wonder if both of you could address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point. I think one of the reasons that we as Americans are sort of behind a lot of the rest of the world on climate is because for a lot of accidents of geography, we've been shielded from some of the worst effects, and many people in the rest of the world are feeling really, really horrible climate effects already. And to return to what Michael was saying a minute ago, it's especially true in the developing world, and that there are many communities, cultures that are really struggling with climate change without the same capacity to address it that we have. And that is one of the big themes of this story at the moment, and will be for the decades to come, the way that global inequality maps onto climate change. In terms of messaging to those people, I don't know if it's like false modesty or false grandiosity for me to say, I don't really think it's my place to be writing articles for like the field workers in El Salvador. But I do think that I do hope that they have people writing for them where they are, for sure. And I do hope that everywhere in the world, people who are feeling the effects, people who are not yet feeling the effects, have access to some kind of storytelling that showcases the risks.
Michael, you had a Something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a huge ethical dimension to this problem, which is that the people who are feeling the worst impacts of climate change already are those who had the least role in creating the problem in the first place. And so there's a huge climate justice aspect to the problem, and I think that has actually gotten a fair amount of prominence in recent years. The sort of the justice, the environmental justice sort of element of climate change, and that's energized a constituency that is really important to energize if we're going to have the sorts of elections that will produce politicians who actually want to do something about these problems. I would also say that, and I repeat this now as a mantra, really, the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. Okay, everybody is feeling the impacts of climate change, and here in the U.S., how many reminders, how many superstorms, including one that essentially destroyed Puerto Rico, that is still finding it difficult to recover, months later, from the impacts of an unprecedented storm, unprecedented wildfires, and it's touching people's lives. The other day, a good friend of mine, I learned that their parents lost a house in the Napa wildfires. And so we are now reaching the point where the impacts of climate change are so near and so evident that people we know are actually being impacted. And I think that's changing. I think that's a game changer when it comes to the sort of dialogue that we need to have if we're going to confront this problem.
Well, I have a problem, which is that we are now sadly out of time. And I don't know how to tell you what a thoughtful and compassionate and honest conversation we've had here with the two of you. And you've made me see some things differently. And I suspect our audience here and in the virtual world as well. You two have gone to enormous trouble to kind of do this for us. I want to thank you both very, very much, because it's this kind of conversation, as it broadens, both through personal conversations, but also through the voices that we strike publicly in the media, such as we are. Those are the things that take us forward. You've taken us some of the distance tonight. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.